In 1886, a band of Apache prisoners rested beside the Southern Pacific Railway near the Nueces River in Texas, people being transported under military escort across a landscape that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. The first house, built on the future site of Dodge City, Kansas, was constructed in August 1872. A simple structure marking the beginning of one of the American West's most mythologized frontier towns. Between 1887 and 1889, men gathered for a poker game at John Doyle's ranch in Arizona, an ordinary social scene from a territory that would not achieve statehood for another 2 decades. The interior of the Table Bluff Hotel and Saloon Bar in Humboldt County, California, was photographed in 1889, a frontier drinking establishment preserving the particular social atmosphere of the late 19th century American West. In 1898, workers laid railroad track across the Arizona desert, connecting the last corners of the frontier to the broader national network that was rapidly making the Wild West a historical memory. In 1886, a family posed beside their covered wagon in Loup Valley, Nebraska, during the Great Western Migration. One household among hundreds of thousands whose movement westward reshaped an entire continent. In 1909, a discovery party made their way across the hot and slick rocks of Navajo Mountain in Utah toward Rainbow Bridge, one of the American Southwest's most extraordinary natural formations, still largely unknown to the outside world. In 1906, a cooking scene was documented at the Gros Ventre camp on the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana. Daily life preserved at a reservation community navigating the enormous pressures of the assimilation era. In March 1886, 11-year-old Jimmy McKinn, who had been taken by Geronimo's band the previous September, was photographed among the Apache. The boy had so completely adapted to life with the band that he bitterly resisted being returned to his family. In 1902, a cowboy with his lasso ready surveyed the open range at the Sherman Ranch in Genesee, Kansas, the vast horizon behind him representing both the freedom and the loneliness that defined life on the open range. Montana cowboys were photographed branding calves, an essential annual ritual of ranching life that marked ownership across the enormous unfenced cattle operations of the American West. A buffalo hide yard in Dodge City, Kansas, photographed in 1878, contained approximately 40,000 hides, a staggering image of the industrial-scale destruction that would reduce the American bison population from tens of millions to near extinction within decades. In 1911, buckboards and coaches zigzagged down the famous W Road on Pikes Peak in Colorado. Early automotive and horse-drawn tourism, navigating a mountain carriage road that had become one of the West's most dramatic, scenic attractions. Men gathered outside the Sweetwater Saloon in Texas, one of countless frontier drinking establishments that served as the social, commercial, and sometimes judicial center of life in communities where formal institutions had not yet arrived. In the 1910s, several men and a dog named Peggy stood inside John Powell's saloon in Plainfield, Illinois, an ordinary tavern portrait capturing the particular social world of a small-town drinking establishment. The Shamrock Saloon in Hazen, Nevada, was photographed in 1905, a small-town frontier bar whose name suggested the Irish immigrant heritage common among the miners and laborers who populated Nevada's boom and bust towns. The interior of the Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City, Kansas, was documented, one of the most famous bars in the American West, its name forever associated with the cattle drive era and the lawmen who policed it. Around 1902, the Northern Saloon in Tonopah, Nevada, was photographed, a drinking establishment co-founded by legendary lawman Wyatt Earp, who had followed the silver boom to one of Nevada's last great mining towns. In 1909, women stood outside the Klondike Dance Hall and Saloon in Seattle, Washington, a frontier entertainment venue whose existence in the city reflected the rough commercial culture that followed the Klondike gold rush northward. By the late 19th century, Fort Worth, Texas, had grown to support over 60 Wild West saloons, of which the White Elephant was among the most prominent, a density of drinking establishments reflecting the city's role as a major stop on the cattle drives. At an unidentified saloon in what may have been Wyoming, patrons were photographed apparently compelling a man to dance at gunpoint in the 1880s, an image that captures one of the frontier West's most frequently described and least reliably documented social rituals. The exterior of Abe Warner's Cobweb Palace in San Francisco, California, was documented, one of the city's most eccentric establishments. Named for the Webbs, its famously odd owner deliberately allowed to accumulate throughout the bar. The interior of the Cobweb Palace revealed the full extent of Abe Warner's unconventional approach to saloon management. Spiders given free rein to web every surface of an establishment that became famous precisely for refusing to conform to any normal standard of cleanliness. The Judge Roy Bean Saloon was photographed in 1900, doubling as a courtroom. The famous Law west of the Pecos, administering frontier justice in the same room where his customers drank, creating one of the American West's most singular combinations of commerce and law. In 1902, the Circle City Saloon in Nome, Alaska was documented, a frontier drinking establishment at the edge of the American world, serving the miners and adventurers who had rushed to Alaska's most recent gold discovery. Men posed inside a Wild West saloon at an unknown date and location, an ordinary frontier bar portrait whose specifics have been lost, but whose atmosphere of rough, masculine social life has been perfectly preserved. A saloon in Pierre, South Dakota was photographed between 1890 and 1900, a frontier drinking establishment in the capital of a brand new state that had only been admitted to the Union in 1889. Bob Younger was one of three brothers who formed the notorious Younger Gang, operating alongside the James brothers. They conducted a series of daring train and bank robberies across the Midwest before a disastrous raid ended their criminal careers. In May 1925, Mary Shannon was sentenced to 2 years in the Nebraska State Prison for mayhem, a criminal record from an era when the American legal system was still working out how to process the growing number of women coming before frontier courts. Emmett Dalton, the youngest of the Dalton Gang brothers, survived the disastrous Coffeyville bank raid that killed most of his family. He later reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman and author, living long enough to see himself become a figure of Wild West legend. In 1876, the gold rush town of Deadwood in the Dakota Territory was photographed, a raw boom town that would soon become one of the most lawless and storied communities in the history of the American frontier. In 1895, a family posed outside their New Mexico home while a Native American servant held their child. A single photograph quietly containing the entire social hierarchy of the post-conquest Southwest. The saloons and less reputable establishments of Hazen, Nevada, were documented in 1905, a small Nevada community whose drinking culture reflected the rough social economy of the mining frontier. In 1907, a cow allegedly carried 7 children to school in Okanogan, Washington, a caption so improbable that the original photographer thought it worth recording, and so charmingly rural that generations since have been happy to believe it. In 1895, a teacher and her students stood in front of their sod schoolhouse in Woods County, Oklahoma, education being conducted in a building made from the same prairie earth that surrounded it, by a teacher who had come farther than most to be there. In 1871, correspondent Fred Loring was photographed with his mule in Arizona. He was killed by Apaches 2 days after this picture was taken, the photograph becoming an inadvertent final portrait. A group of trappers and hunters in Arizona's Four Peaks country were documented along with their dogs and burros, a family of working frontiersmen whose names and specific stories survive only through this single detailed caption. Between 1867 and 1888, mine workers emerged from a shaft in Virginia City, Nevada. Men whose underground labor in one of the richest silver deposits ever found created enormous fortunes that rarely flowed to them. In 1882, a blacksmithing class was photographed at the Forest Grove School in Oregon. Vocational education at an institution that served Native American students as part of the era's deeply problematic assimilation programs. In 1878, Cheyenne Indians were held prisoner in the Dodge City Jail after being captured while attempting to return to the Black Hills from an Oklahoma reservation, people being imprisoned for the act of trying to go home. In 1872, a group of Paiute people were photographed near Cedar, Utah. Indigenous individuals documented by outside photographers in ways that rarely captured the full complexity of their communities and cultures. In 1872, Twin Buttes near Green River City in Wyoming were photographed. Dramatic geological formations rising from the high desert that early survey photographers documented as part of the systematic mapping of the American West. In 1867, members of Clarence King's 40th Parallel Survey Team were photographed near Oriana, Nevada, scientists and photographers conducting one of the most ambitious geographical surveys in American history. In 1867, the Pyramid Domes, a formation of tufa rocks rising from Pyramid Lake in Nevada, were photographed. Natural formations that had existed for thousands of years before Western photographers arrived to document them. In 1873, a panoramic view documented Camp Beauty in Canyon de Chelly, Arizona, tents and shelters on the canyon floor beneath the towering rock walls that had sheltered human habitation for centuries before the survey parties arrived. In 1873, The old mission church at Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico was photographed from the plaza, a Spanish colonial structure imposed on an indigenous landscape, its architecture representing centuries of encounter between two very different cultural systems. In 1871, photographer Timothy O'Sullivan was documented with fellow survey members and Native Americans following their ascent of the Colorado River through the Black Canyon, one of the most demanding photographic expeditions in the history of the American West. In 1872, Browns Park in Colorado was photographed, a remote high valley that had served as a wintering ground for mountain men and would later become a hideout for outlaws, including Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. In 1874, Shoshone Falls on the Snake River in Idaho were photographed, a waterfall whose drop exceeded Niagara Falls in height, documented by survey photographers as part of the systematic visual cataloging of the American West. In 1867, Timothy O'Sullivan's darkroom wagon was photographed in Nevada's Carson Sink, a technical behind-the-scenes image of the mobile photography operation that allowed early photographers to process images in the field. In 1867, the mining town of Gold Hill, just south of Virginia City, Nevada was photographed, a boomtown whose fortunes were entirely tied to the Comstock Lode silver deposit, and which would eventually be abandoned when that deposit was exhausted. In 1871, a wooden balanced incline used for gold mining at the Illinois mine in Nevada was documented, early industrial infrastructure solving the specific mechanical problem of moving ore from the bottom of a steep slope to a processing facility. In 1867, photographer Timothy O'Sullivan worked 900 feet underground in the silver mines of Virginia City, Nevada, using burning magnesium wire as a flash to capture some of the earliest photographs ever made in underground industrial settings. In 1872, the headlands north of the Colorado River Plateau were photographed. Dramatic geological formations documenting the landscape that survey expeditions were systematically mapping as part of America's post-Civil War westward expansion. In 1875, a group of Paiute men, women, and children were photographed near Cottonwood Springs in Nevada, indigenous people documented in a formal posed image that reveals more about the conventions of 19th century survey photography than about the subjects themselves. Around 1871, photographer O'Sullivan documented a Spanish inscription carved into sandstone at what is now El Morro National Monument in New Mexico, a message left by a Spanish official in 1726 that had been waiting for nearly a century and a half for someone to photograph it. In 1873, photographer O'Sullivan documented Navajo life near Old Fort Defiance in New Mexico, indigenous people going about their daily lives in a landscape they had inhabited for generations before and during the American occupation of the Southwest. In 1873, the White House cliff dwellings in Canyon de Chelly, Arizona were photographed, ancestral Pueblo structures built more than 500 years earlier, their presence in a living Navajo homeland, adding layers of meaning to every image taken there. In 1874, a man bathed in Pagosa Hot Spring in Colorado, an ordinary human pleasure documented by a survey photographer who captured both the dramatic landscape and the people moving through it. In 1871, Maimon, a Mojave Indian who served as a guide and interpreter for survey expeditions in Colorado country, was photographed, one of the indigenous individuals whose knowledge of the land made Western exploration possible. In 1873, Oak Grove in Arizona's White Mountains was photographed near Sierra Blanca, an early documentary image of a landscape that remains one of the most beautiful and least visited corners of the American Southwest. Around 1880, the Bob Saloon in Miles City, Montana was documented, a frontier drinking establishment in a cattle town that served as the endpoint for some of the era's longest and most famous cattle drives. In the late 19th century, a patron cradled a rifle outside Jackson's Bar in Idaho, an image of armed frontier masculinity that captured the casual relationship between men and weapons that defined the American West. At the Fashion Saloon in Winslow, Arizona, members of the notorious Hash Knife Cowboys posed for a photograph. Ranch hands hired to manage a massive cattle operation, who gained an unsavory reputation for violence and lawlessness that eventually brought them into conflict with local authorities. In an 1895 Arizona saloon, gamblers played Faro, a card game so popular in the frontier West that it became synonymous with the saloon culture of the era before its association with cheating eventually drove it out of fashion. In March 1931, a man named Jake Voland attempted to steal chickens using a simple entry method. A homemade alarm system alerted the owners, and what might have been a completely forgotten minor crime became part of the historical record. In 1912, 20-year-old Juanita McCamey was arrested in San Diego and charged with criminal conspiracy for participating in a public labor protest. one of many workers across America who faced criminal charges for exercising what later generations would consider basic rights. Hal Little received a sentence of 12 to 15 years in the Nebraska State Prison for bank robbery, one record among countless others from an era when frontier justice dispensed long sentences with efficiency. In 1894, Wyoming authorities briefly captured outlaw Butch Cassidy on a horse theft charge and took his mugshot. At that point, his most famous crime still lay ahead, and the photograph documented a young man whose legend had not yet fully formed. An A.A. Denny locomotive belonging to the Columbia and Puget Sound Railway was photographed in 1879. Early rail infrastructure connecting the Pacific Northwest to the broader network that was transforming the region's economy. In 1879, an old schoolhouse on 6th Street in a western community was documented. Early educational infrastructure serving communities that were still building the basic institutions of civic life. The Combination Saloon in Utah was photographed in the late 19th century. A frontier drinking establishment serving a territory whose dominant religious culture officially discouraged alcohol, but whose mining and railroad populations enthusiastically ignored that guidance. A cowboy was photographed roping a calf for branding, one of the essential skills of the ranching profession, requiring years of practice to master and performed thousands of times across the open ranges of the American West. Branding irons were photographed, the fundamental tools of cattle ranching, whose marks established ownership across the enormous unfenced ranges of the American West. An assistant was photographed helping immobilize a calf during the branding process, the two-person teamwork required for this essential ranching task, unchanged in its basics from the 19th century to the present day. In 1905, photographer Edward Curtis documented 6 Native American leaders present for President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade. Indigenous figures whose attendance at an American presidential ceremony represented the complex and often painful negotiations of that era. In 1906, photographer Edward Curtis captured indigenous dancers in a photograph titled "Watching the Dancers," part of his decades-long project to document Native American life before the culture he was observing changed beyond recognition. In 1891, photographer John C. H. Gravel documented Oglala chiefs American Horse and Red Cloud in South Dakota, two of the most prominent Native American leaders of the era, photographed just a year after the Wounded Knee Massacre. In 1885, Apache leader Geronimo fled the Arizona reservation, triggering widespread panic across the region. A breakout that would extend for another year before his final surrender ended the last major armed resistance to American authority in the Southwest. On this date, in 1869, the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory, Utah, completing the first transcontinental railroad, a moment that ended the era of the wagon train and fundamentally transformed the speed and scale of American westward movement. Around 1905, William F. Buffalo Bill Cody demonstrated buffalo hunting techniques for audiences at his Wild West show, theatrical performances that helped create and spread the mythology of the American frontier to audiences who had never seen it. In 1908, 2 Apt Saluki riders on horseback were photographed outside a teepee in a snow-covered Montana forest, an image capturing both the dignity and the resilience of a people navigating life within a reservation system that constrained their movement. Around 1876, Calamity Jane was photographed in Deadwood, South Dakota, a woman whose legend combined genuine frontier skill with a talent for self-promotion that made her one of the most recognizable figures of the Wild West era. Around 1860, mountain man James Beckwourth was photographed, an explorer, trapper, and adventurer of African American heritage, whose extraordinary life included discovering a Sierra Nevada mountain pass that still bears his name. Around 1878, the gold rush boomtown of Deadwood in the Dakota Territory was photographed at the height of its chaotic prosperity, a settlement operating with almost no formal law in a place where fortunes could be made and lost between sunrise and sunset. Around 1888, a group of Apache defendants were photographed in Globe, Arizona, after a courtroom verdict before being transported to Yuma Territorial Prison, indigenous men entering an incarceration system at the very end of the Apache resistance. In 1890, cowboys rested under a tree at Rancho Santa Anita in California, an image of working ranch life in a state whose cattle ranching heritage was already being transformed by urbanization and the arrival of new agricultural industries. In 1881, Billy the Kid was convicted of murder in New Mexico, a legal proceeding that would be followed within months by his escape from custody and his eventual shooting by Sheriff Pat Garrett. Around 1876, mountain man Jim Bridger was photographed, A legendary trapper, scout, and explorer whose knowledge of the western landscape was so encyclopedic that military commanders and survey parties sought him as a guide well into his old age. In February 1847, the first rescue party finally reached the stranded Donner Party in the Sierra Nevada. Finding survivors who had endured an unimaginable winter ordeal since being trapped by snowfall the previous October, with tree stumps, photographed 19 years later, showing the snow had reached several feet deep. In January 1878, long simmering tensions in Lincoln County, New Mexico erupted into violence with the murder of English rancher John Tunstall, an event that triggered the Lincoln County War and drew into its orbit a young gunfighter known as Billy the Kid. Between 1893 and 1903, a young Ute man was photographed in Navajo Springs, Arizona, an indigenous individual documented during the decades when the reservation system was being enforced with particular rigidity across the American Southwest. In 1886, musicians performed on State Street near Figueroa Street in Santa Barbara, California, street entertainment in a California city that was simultaneously celebrating its Spanish colonial heritage and transforming under the influence of the American settlement that had followed. Misión Nuestra Señora de la Soledad was photographed between 1877 and 1884, one of California's original Spanish missions in a state of partial ruin, its thick adobe walls already beginning the long process of returning to the earth from which they were made. Around 1883, a railroad track crew celebrated the completion of the Sunset Route just west of the Pecos River in Texas, the connection of another transcontinental line transforming the geography of commerce and travel across the American South. The Vernon Dice House along Tatum Boulevard in Phoenix was photographed in 1961 and again in 2015, a then and now comparison that captures how dramatically the suburban landscape of a rapidly growing southwestern city can transform within a single lifetime. Beginning in the 1972 season, broadcaster Al McCoy became the voice of the Phoenix Suns, a radio presence who had already been familiar in the Valley since 1957 and who would go on to become one of the longest-serving announcers in NBA history. In 1885, Flagstaff, Arizona was photographed 9 years before the town was officially incorporated, an early view of a community still finding its shape along the route of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Farmer Goodwin Mansion, built by a man who was subsequently sent to Yuma Territorial Prison, later became Arizona State University's first dormitory, one of Arizona's best-preserved historic adobe structures with a history that reflects the rough social transitions of the territorial period. In 1931, the University of Arizona's polo team left campus for a competitive tour of the eastern states, an early example of collegiate athletics extending their reach across the country before widespread air travel made such journeys routine. In 1922, the last federal troops left Fort Apache as the first Lutheran mission was dedicated there, the simultaneous departure of military authority and arrival of missionary religion, marking a significant transition in the history of the Apache homeland. In 1927, 38 Yaqui Indians who had fled across the border after a battle with Mexican troops were held by the United States Army. Refugees caught between two governments, neither of which fully recognized the legitimacy of their claims. A 1925 photograph of the University of Arizona's campus pool showed students using the water to cope with the Arizona summer heat, an enduring solution to the desert climate that university students have employed in various forms ever since. In 1921, the Arizona Supreme Court ruled that the state could not tax livestock owned by non-residents, a legal decision reflecting the complex economic relationships between cattle operations that moved animals across state lines as part of normal ranching practice. In 1865, the little adobe Catholic church in Yuma served all faiths in a frontier community that had no other religious gathering places. A building so modest, it lacked even basic seating, yet which served as the spiritual center of a diverse desert community. In 1924, Chiricahua National Monument was established to protect a landscape of extraordinary rock formations that gave the park its nickname the Wonderland of Rock, geological structures carved by millions of years of volcanic activity and erosion. In 1937, Tucson grocers established minimum pricing standards to address unfair competitive practices, a local economic regulation reflecting the broader tensions between small retailers and larger commercial interests during the late Depression era. In 1928, a dedication ceremony was held at the stone marker over the graves of Union soldiers killed at the Battle of Picacho Pass in April 1862. The westernmost Civil War engagement, fought in Arizona territory far from the conflict's main theaters, on April 19, 1930, approximately 5,200 children packed into 4 downtown Phoenix theaters for a children's Easter Jubilee. an organized civic celebration bringing the city's youth together on one of the year's most family-oriented holidays. Bert Alvord served as a respected lawman in Cochise County before leading a train robbery in 1899 that transformed him from officer of the law into one of the Arizona Territory's most wanted outlaws. A dramatic personal reversal that reflected the fluid moral boundaries of frontier life. In 1885, Geronimo and 20 of his warriors escaped from American forces after briefly surrendering to General George Crook. A breakout that extended the final phase of Apache resistance and sent military and civilian communities across the region into a state of alarm. In 1907, the Arizona Territorial Legislature moved the territorial prison from Yuma to Florence, transferring one of the West's most notorious incarceration facilities from the desert heat of the Colorado River to a new location in the center of the territory. In 1901, Governor Nathan Murphy authorized the establishment of the Arizona Rangers, a company of frontier law enforcement officers created to address the particular security challenges of a territory that would not achieve statehood for another 11 years. On March 20th, 1889, a train on the Atlantic and Pacific Line was robbed at Canyon Diablo in Arizona. Sheriff Bucky O'Neill and his posse subsequently tracked the robbers across the desert before capturing them in Utah. In 1934, Governor Benjamin Moore sent Arizona National Guard detachments to patrol the Colorado River at Parker, a dramatic dispute with California over the planned construction of Parker Dam that briefly brought the two states to the edge of a genuine interstate confrontation. Buffalo Bill Cody and his estranged wife Lulu were photographed together, an image from a marriage that had endured decades of distance created by his extraordinary career as scout, showman, and American celebrity. On this day in 1917, Buffalo Bill Cody died, ending the life of a man whose Wild West shows had done more than almost any other single enterprise to shape how America and the world imagined the frontier. 6 days before his death, the final photograph of Buffalo Bill Cody was taken in Glenwood Springs in January 1917, the last image of a man whose life had spanned the entire arc of the American West from its wildest days to its domestication. In 1890, the Eaton brothers of Pittsburgh were photographed with their families at the Custer Trail Ranch near Medora in the Dakota Territory. Early dude ranchers offering Eastern visitors an experience of Western life that was already becoming a luxury commodity. Around 1885, a young Theodore Roosevelt spent time in the Dakota Badlands following the death of his first wife, a period of grief and physical hardship that he would later credit with transforming him into the vigorous public figure he became. In 1899, an unidentified Ute man was photographed on a hunt, an indigenous person practicing the traditional subsistence activities that reservation life was increasingly restricting. His image captured by an outside photographer whose purpose he may not have fully understood. The silver mining industry at Tombstone, Arizona ended on this date in 1911, when rising underground water combined with falling silver prices made continued operations economically impossible. The end of a boom that had made Tombstone one of the most famous towns in the American West. Steamboat, the famously unrideable bucking bronco whose image appears on Wyoming license plates, was one of the most celebrated rodeo horses in American history. An animal so consistently unconquerable that his reputation has outlasted almost every rider who attempted to stay on him. In the 1870s, dogs were an important part of the Uinta Ute culture, working animals and companions whose roles within the community reflected the practical requirements and social values of the people they lived alongside. In 1889, artist Frederick Remington illustrated Cowboys Coming to Town for Christmas, a painting capturing the seasonal migration of ranch hands from the open range into frontier towns for the holiday, one of the most anticipated social events of the cattle drive era. In 1884, cattle baron John Chisholm died in Arkansas, a man whose enormous New Mexico ranching empire had made him one of the most powerful and controversial figures in the Lincoln County War that had defined the region just years before.